Path of the Pole by Charles Hapgood, Part 11. You are listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
That's better.
Yep.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons, monsters and serpents. This is Brothers of the Serpent podcast, and we are coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 tangent cube of science, where we are nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Edwards Plateau. So I think this will be the final, we'll see. I think this will be the final episode in the Path of the Pole series.
11.
Is that the longest book report? I think it is.
I think so.
Most parts.
Yeah.
And also the longest. Like, even if it wasn't the most parts, it would be the longest because we've had so many different...
interspersed it with so many different random episodes.
But yeah, we were actually... So when we finished up last week, we were near the end of the chapter we're in here about evolution, and the next chapter is conclusion. But then... And that's only, that's 70% of the book. The rest, there's like a ton of notes, letters between him and Einstein, and then conversations he's had with other scientists that I've marked up because there's so much good stuff in there. But I really recommend people, I'm not going to read a bunch of it. There's a lot of technical details, some really cool stuff. Hopefully we'll be able to get into some of it this episode, but there's some fascinating ideas just about the way the Earth functions, and it's really cool. So hopefully we'll be able to get into that. But let's finish up this chapter here on evolution. So we finished where we ended last time. We were talking about this concept of islands and ones that have mountains and ones that don't, and how they and how the mountains can actually help transport species across different climatic zones during the shifts. In other words, the island is isolated from larger land masses, and if you have a species that wants cooler weather, they'll be up on the mountain. And if the whole island moves towards the equator, they can climb the mountain to stay in their same zone. Right. And they can do that within days, right? Going the other way, the same thing. They can come down, right? If the island is getting colder and they want warmer weather, they can come down off the mountain.
Right.
So then he says, so let us contrast with Java, the situation of a small island or island group such as the Bermudas, the Azores, or the Canaries, where in general we find the life forms to be impoverished. In other words, there's not a whole lot of diversity of life forms there. These islands, often far from the nearest continent, may have been separated from it, of course, for long periods of time. Now let us suppose one of them, say the Azores, to be displaced through about 2,000 miles of latitude in one movement of the crust in either direction. Where will the indigenous species go? Obviously, there will be no refuge for them. Therefore, many of them will succumb. Subsequently, the sea will be an effective barrier to the repopulation of the islands from the mainland. As to the distribution of life forms across the climatic zones, referred to as bipolar mirrorism, Darwin proposed, so this is talking about how you can have similar life forms in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. How do they get across all the non-Arctic zones in between? And this is called bipolar mirrorism. Darwin proposed an explanation in Chapter 12 of the Origin of Species that can no longer be accepted. He supposed, first, that glacial periods alternated in the northern and southern hemispheres. This idea has long since been given up. Then Darwin reasoned that when there was an ice age in the northern hemisphere, the climatic zones would be displaced southward, and the temperate zone species would migrate southward. When that ice age ended and the climate warmed up, the temperate species that had migrated southward would now ascend into the mountains where they would survive in the tropical zone. There are, of course, mountains in the tropics high enough to be snow-capped the year round. On these, even Arctic plants might exist. The next step, according to Darwin, would be the onset of an ice age in the southern hemisphere. Now the temperature in the southern tropics would fall and become temperate, and the temperate species would descend from their mountains and migrate across the valleys southward to the south temperate zone. In this way, the migration of the species from the northern to the southern temperate zone would be accomplished. Now, this idea of the species clambering up and down the mountainsides in response to the changing weather is a good one and gives us one key to the problem. Where Darwin went wrong was in his alternating ice age theory. He could hardly be blamed in view of the prevailing ignorance about ice ages. Darwin, of course, lived at a time when people were first getting used to the idea of ice ages. But if Darwin was wrong, if ice ages do not regularly alternate in the northern and southern hemispheres, how do we explain bipolar mirrorism? For some decades now, glaciologists have been holding grimly to the always frowning. They're holding grimly to the theory that ice ages were always simultaneous in the two hemispheres. In maintaining this view, they have ignored the fact that they have made mincemeat of Darwin's explanation of bipolar mirrorism. But this does not concern them. They are grim. They are concerned with explaining ice ages, not with the distribution of species. They have suggested no alternative explanation for the migration of species across the climatic zones. Instead, they have constructed a theory that puts the migration of species and even the survival of tropical species into the realm of sheer impossibility. They insist, we remember, that the temperature of the whole Earth was simultaneously lowered in glacial periods. We have seen that at various times in the past, great continental ice caps have existed at sea level within the tropics and even on the equator itself. I have already pointed out that if the world temperature had been lowered enough to permit a continental ice cap in the Congo, there would have been no place of refuge for tropical species of plants and animals. Nowhere along the circle of the equator around the Earth would any tropical species have survived. This would be equally true of land and sea forms of life. Bipolar mirrorism, however, presents no problems if we can reconsider it in terms of displacements of the crust. One movement, let us suppose, takes the Rocky Mountains 2,000 miles to the south. The species climb higher. Later, in a series of movements of the crust, not always, of course, in the same direction, the Rockies finally end up south of the equator in a temperate climate. Now the species climb down and occupy the temperate valleys of the southern hemisphere. The mountain chain has functioned as a ferry boat, simply transporting species back and forth. At this point, it is interesting to reflect on how useful it is to have these high mountain ranges. A low mountain range would never do. It could never ferry a load of species across the tropical zone. I do think that's a really interesting idea. Okay, part 5, the periods of revolutionary changes in life forms. So the reader may have gained the impression that while certain aspects of evolution have escaped satisfactory explanation, at least the process itself has continued evenly through all time. To this reader, it may come as a shock, as it did to me, to learn that this is not at all the case. There have been remarkable variations in the rate of evolution. For long periods, it has marked time, and then some force hitherto unidentified has initiated a phase of rapid change, a revolution changing so many forms of plant and animal life as to alter the general complexion of life on the Earth. All paleontologists appear to agree on this point. Dr. Simpson uses the term Viren's period to define the periods of rapid change. Others refer to explosive phases of evolution or to quantum evolution. Just throw quantum in there. It means it's complicated. Yeah. It must be understood that development during these periods is rapid only relatively. New forms are still not created overnight. One phenomenon that frequently occurs during these periods is termed adaptive radiation. This is a kind of explosion in which one form or species rapidly gives rise to dozens, scores, or even hundreds of new forms apparently at one and the same time. How is this phenomenon accounted for? We must distinguish between the biological process and the circumstances that cause it to occur. The process is easily explained. Let us suppose that a form of plant or animal is spread over a considerable area. Its total population may include some millions of individuals. Over its whole distribution, there will be local variations in the environment, and consequently there will be selection pressures operating simultaneously but in different directions on different parts of the population in different habitats. New varieties of the plant or animal will tend to appear to take advantage of special opportunities offered by particular local environments. This sort of thing is always going on, but it does not by itself produce explosions of adaptive radiation. Something more is required. Normally, a new variety of any form has to compete with other forms already in possession of the necessary supplies of food, light, and water. The situation that has the particular combination of these things required by a given plant or animal is referred to as its life or ecological niche. Naturally, if this niche is already effectively occupied, the spread of the new variety is restricted. As an analogy, think of a garden in which you have set out 100 expensive strawberry plants of a totally new variety just before being called away for 2 months on urgent business, requiring your presence in a foreign country. What now happens? Weeds immediately take over the niche you had hoped to preserve artificially for the spread of the strawberry plants, and their spread is restricted and their survival may be threatened. In nature, what seemed to be required to permit the very rapid dissemination of many new variant forms of the original plant or animal is an absence of competition. Empty life niches are required. The question is, how is an empty life niche produced? Occasionally, of course, it may have been there from the beginning. It may never have been occupied because presumably there never was any form of life that could utilize it. But after 2 billion or more years of evolution, such primeval biological vacuums are few indeed. Life niches have, in general, been very well occupied for a very long time. Something is required, therefore, to empty them. So we kind of went through this with the hybridization stuff, too. And other times we've talked about evolution is that it seems like, you get it, you have some kind of cataclysmic event and that it empties out certain places that life holds, and then new forms can come in and take those places. But up until that point, you end up with a stable situation, right? Because
and it makes it harder for any new species or some new adaptation to take hold.
Yeah,
there's no room.
That's right.
In the niche.
Yeah. Like if you want to be the fish that like chews on the stuff that's caught in the shark's teeth. But there's already a fish that does that.
You need more sharks, which means less other fish.
Well, I mean, how do you move in? The shark's like just going to eat you because you're not the fish that normally does that.
Point.
Yeah.
They need bigger mouths so you can fit more fish on them.
Okay.
That's where the shovels came from.
So this is where our theory comes in. The effects of a displacement can be visualized in 2 stages. In the first, a movement of a large continental area through many degrees of latitude might well cause a very general extermination of the inhabitants. We have seen how, in several instances, this occurred during the late Pleistocene. The consequence of the extermination of many kinds of plants and animals, which is not to say their extinction, for many of them might survive in other areas, would be to leave their life niches empty. The second stage, initiated by a new movement of the crust, would be marked by the opening up of avenues for the immigration of life forms from other land areas. Life forms entering the continent would now enjoy a field day. They would multiply. They would occupy rapidly a tremendous area and all manner of habitats, and they would produce variant forms, and the variant forms would occupy appropriate niches. Thus, explosive evolution would take place. The new forms need not always be immigrants. They could equally well be local survivors of the period of depopulation, of the displacement, who had somehow managed to hold their own under unfavorable conditions. It seems highly probable, indeed, that displacements of the Earth's crust are the explanation of explosive evolution. So he says they are the explanation, but I think they're one possible explanation.
Yeah.
And even then, just one of, because also impacts, massive volcanism, these things, any catastrophic event.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when it comes to, what did you call it? It's not bilateral. It's
bipolar
mirrorism. Like what do they call it? Nuclear winter or whatever.
Yeah.
From a massive volcanism or whatever you would call. What is that called when it's volcanism? It causes a winter.
Yeah.
Anyway, that could be the way that things migrate. You know, if you get the ice ball effect, then like the polar animals can go anywhere.
Right, but that'll also kill all the temperate and tropical species, which then they would have to start from nothing.
Or there's some places where they can still live.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was thinking of just other ways that you might get, you know, enough cool weather in certain places where they could travel far enough south and then end up, when it starts to warm back up, they end up just keep going south.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's just an interesting idea. Like there's...
In other words, it doesn't have to be crustal shift is what I'm saying.
Right.
It could be other ways.
Yeah, I do think that he's trying to point out that like if you either warm the earth up to allow temperate species to, you know, they can't cross the tropics, or and then the northern or deep southern species can't cross the middle area either, right? So
you have to have something catastrophic.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we have already made mention of the fact that an interrelationship between the revolutionary periods in evolution and the critical phases of change in other geological areas has been noted by many observers. Lull, for example, says, quote, "There are times of quickening, the expression points of evolution, which are almost invariably coincident with some great geological change, and the correspondence is so exact and so frequent that the laws of chance may not be invoked as an explanation." Geologists who have sought an explanation of the relationship between biological and geological change have, in some cases, favored the idea that geological change, such as the formation of new mountain ranges, might have caused both ice ages and biological change. We have seen that this will not account for ice ages. We have also seen that geologists now generally admit their failure to explain mountain building. It is unsatisfactory to attempt to explain the known by the unknown. It will not do to drag in mountain building as the cause of evolution when the former is also unexplained. Displacements of the Earth's crust appear to be the connecting link between these different processes. They explain at one and the same time ice ages, mountain formation, and the significant turning points of evolution. Part 6, the extinction of species. It has already been shown that periodical displacements of the lithosphere can provide an explanation for the extinction of species. Some further discussion of this problem is, however, required. It has been suggested that the history of any particular species can be compared with the life of an individual, with its phases of youth, maturity, and old age. Thus, the explosive period is the youth of a species. The period of quiet and prosperous enjoyment of its life is maturity, and its degenerative phase is its old age. Finally, extinction results from the exhaustion of the vital force of the species. This theory assumes an innate cause and a natural order for the succession of the phases. This idea has been widely disseminated, and in one form or another it has served to confuse all the issues and obscure the known facts. It is one more of those philosophical abstractions that people resort to who come up against an unsolved problem and cannot stand the psychological tension of persevering in the search for truth. It is important that the essentials of this matter should be made clear. In the first place, the idea that a species is analogous to an individual and must go through similar phases is a modern revival of the scholastic logic of the Middle Ages, like the microcosm-macrocosm analogy, which I think, when I read this, I was thinking microcosm-macrocosm this is like the as above, so below thing, I think, is what he's... So he says, according to which some people have recently argued that since planets are satellites of the sun and electrons are satellites of the nucleus of the atom, then planets are exactly like electrons and must obey the same laws of physics. The alleged vital force, which is supposed to set a preordained limit to the life of a species, completely escapes scientific observation and experiment. It is not only a mere assumption, it is also an unjustified assumption. The facts of paleontology do not agree with the analogy between the life phases of a species and those of an individual. In very many cases, the same phase may be repeated several times in the life of a species, and other phases may be omitted altogether, as we shall see.
So microcosm, macrocosm analogy is a vision of cosmos where the part reflects the whole and vice versa. So yeah,
Okay.
as above, so below in a
Yeah.
sense. And I mean, that's true in some respects, at least in the universe.
There are reflections, but they're not perfect, right?
Right.
But this
People
is
call it fractal. you know.
But this is interesting, that the idea that, because I have read this in many places, that you get a species, it shows up, it struggles to get its place, and then suddenly it massively replicates and becomes dominant for a long time, and then somehow it becomes degenerate, and then it dies out. This is kind of a it's a non-scientific idea is basically what he's saying here. Okay, so the facts of paleontology do not agree with this analogy. In very many cases, the same phase may be repeated several times in the life. So the same phase, in other words, the young part and the middle-aged part, right?
Right.
Yeah. So for this reason, the theory brings caustic comment from Dr. Simpson. After discussing the two phases of adaptive radiation, or youth, and intrazonal adaptation, or establishment in a stable but limited environment, which is analogous to maturity, these often do follow each other in this order. He explains their relationship thus, quote, "The sequence radiation, intrazonal, evolution is usual, simply because radiation does not occur unless there are diverse zones within which evolution will soon follow. Occasionally, nevertheless, something happens to close the zones so soon that radiation is curtailed, or the intrazonal phase is even shorter than the radiation. The Camariate crinoids, for instance, seem to have been in the full swing of irradiation when they all became extinct in the Carboniferous." So that's just basically saying that some species are in their quote-unquote youth phase, and then they just die,
Right.
which is all, that happens, right?
Yeah, but you can also like have a bottleneck, for example, and then they return
Yes.
and flourish. And so
Right.
that's like going through youth twice.
Yes, right. That's the point that he makes later.
He's one of those guys. It's not a perfect analogy, bro.
We note that Dr.
Jesus.
Simpson. We note that Dr. Simpson says something happens. Well, what happens? He does not care to suggest what might happen to close the zones, to curtail the radiation, to destroy the species. No one has ever suggested a reasonable explanation of these things, but they can be understood as effects of repeated displacements of the crust. Dr. Simpson has remarked elsewhere that he does not object to the analogy between the species and the individual, provided it may be allowed that youth may follow maturity and may occur more than once. Not only may phases, that's pretty snarky, bro. That's snark. Not only may phases occur in the wrong order and be repeated, but also some may be omitted. This seems particularly true of the last or so-called senile period. No concept has had so wide occurrency with so little support and evidence as that of the alleged degeneration of species. The reasoning behind it is essentially specious. If a form of life becomes extinct, and if some exaggerated trait can be pointed to, which might have produced this extinction, then it is claimed that the species was degenerate. This is, of course, merely hindsight, because it ignores the fact that some of the oddest creatures in the world have lasted for millions of years and still exist. It is true that some kinds of plants and animals become adapted to very narrowly specialized environments, so that an almost imperceptible change in the environment may destroy them. These forms may, if you like, be called overspecialized, but they cannot be called degenerate. No inner process of decay has taken place in the organism. Its extinction results from the external circumstance that destroys its relationship with its environment. Is the specialist who has spent his entire life in the study of the Precambrian and therefore is incapable of making his living in any field outside of geology or even outside of Precambrian geology degenerate? If he starves to death, is his extinction due to degeneration?
That's a pretty good analogy
Yeah.
to the jobs. But I would just say that, if you wanted to go a little deeper into like the life analogy, the life of a single, individual, you could put in sickness or, health and sickness.
Yeah.
As opposed to like young and old. So like someone's growing up and then they get a disease or they get a really bad case of the flu and they're almost dead for a while.
Yeah.
And then they come back and then they're like back in their youth again.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep.
So it's environmental
Yeah.
pressures, but yeah, they got sick and then they
Right.
got well.
Yes. But I do think that this is a good point, that there's no decay,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's
Or at
not-
least no known. It's possible that some species have actually become degenerate and
like
they just,
they're talking about decay in terms of evolution. Like
Yeah.
they start to develop traits that are just
yeah.
bad.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So they don't think that happens. Or
Well,
the environment shifts away from them is more.
Right. He's basically saying there's this idea, but it isn't that no one actually thinks that this is the case.
Right.
Right. Okay. So supposing that we allow
Sorry.
what?
I'd never even thought of that possibility. Like, that is an interesting idea, though. No one thinks it's the case, though. But still.
Well, people may have thought that at first, but I guess what I'm getting from this is that by the time he's writing this book, this is not a scientifically considered idea
for sure.
anymore.
Right.
But it's still a popular idea in terms of evolution, I think is what he's trying to say. It may have been initially proposed, right? That there's some kind of degeneration or whatever, but that's just not the case.
Yeah.
So he says, supposing that we allow a phenomenon of degeneration in species, it is still true that most species disappear without showing any indication whatever of a decline of their vital force. The majority of them are cut off in the vigor of maturity or in youth. Moreover, there is no rule as to the relative length of the different periods. Dr. Simpson remarks, quote, diversification may be brief or prolonged, and may be of limited scope or may ramify into the most extraordinarily varied zones, covering a breadth of total adaptation that would have been totally unpredictable and incredible if we were aware only of the beginning of the process. Continuing, he says, episodes of proliferation may come early, middle, or late in the history of a group. This confirms the conclusion that adaptive radiation is episodic, but not cyclic or cyclical.
And of course, this is all based on the fossil record.
Right.
Right. Which is like very special circumstances for those individuals.
Right. That's right.
So it's just.
Did he talk about that already, or is that coming up? Because I know he mentions the whole fossil record thing.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm just saying, like, it's hard to figure out, like, because it takes really special circumstances to create this preserved specimen in the first place. A lot of times it's catastrophic.
Yeah.
To then base the evolution of the species life on those very special circumstances is already
Yeah.
like grasping at straws, I guess you'd say.
That's right. Yeah. There's not a lot of data.
Yeah.
And it's, actually, if you think about it.
It's the best data we have, but
Right.
it's not, it's
Yeah.
very incomplete.
If you think about it, probably I would say that the vast majority of species that have ever lived on Earth, there's no record
have
of
no
it.
idea that
right. There's no record. Yeah. So you can't even make any assumptions or observations about that, right? Not really. I mean, you could speculate.
You could at least say that I would say it's possible, I could be wrong, but the vast majority of species that proliferated in like great quantities, we would have records. Like you would see most of those in the fossil record.
Yeah.
Just
But
because
you
there's
wouldn't
so many of them, the probability of them being preserved is high.
Right. But anything that we might think of as like endangered.
Yeah,
when
or
there's
like
only-
he was saying, this special niche type
yeah.
things. And that could be the vast majority of
Yeah.
species that ever existed.
Yeah, the purple
those.
spotted flutter-throated gnat doesn't have a fossil record.
Yeah.
So we
The
have
banana head shark. he didn't last very long.
We have already noted that Darwin recognized that the ordinary competition of species could not account for the mass extinction of whole groups, of which even then there were many known instances in the fossil record. And since his day, paleontologists have found very many more cases of apparently well-adapted species, which in some cases had flourished for tens of millions of years and yet suddenly disappeared, sometimes leaving their life niches empty, and at other times giving way to inferior species as their successors. For the Pleistocene alone, the last million years, as we have seen, the examples of this include the mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed cat, the giant beaver, giant sloth, giant bison, and countless extinct varieties of still existing forms like horses, deer, camels, armadillos, wolves, bears, etc. Dr. Simpson, in discussing the extinction of the dinosaurs, remarks, okay, so now before I read these quotes, this is before they accepted the impact, the KT impact, right?
Yeah.
Quote, "It should be emphasized that these mass extinctions are not instantaneous or even brief events. They extend over periods of tens of millions of years. This makes the phenomenon all the more mysterious because we have to think of environmental changes that not only affected a great many different groups in different environments, but also did so very slowly and very persistently. The only general and true statement that can now be made about, say, the extinction of the dinosaurs is that they all lost adaptation in the course of some long environmental change, the nature of which is entirely unknown." Unquote.
Well, it is true.
So he's right about all of this. They lost adaptation in the course of some environmental change, but it wasn't short. I mean, it wasn't a very long process, right? Like the environmental change took place almost instantly, and then they died out.
Yeah.
Over
and that
time
may have
after
been,
that.
that may have been.
I mean, they didn't all die when
Right.
the thing hit, but there was an instant change.
in the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the environment spent a lot of time adjusting to this massive input of energy and materials and stuff. So there was an instantaneous change. Well, basically instantaneous, a couple of seconds, right?
Yeah.
Minutes. And then there was years, decades, centuries
aftermath
of
and-
aftermath and aftershocks and volcanism and all kinds of stuff that resulted in a constant and very massively fluctuating situation that eventually kills off most of the current megafauna at the time. But what's interesting is, I've seen, and this is kind of a flippant comment, but I've seen plenty of paleontologists say there are no dinosaur fossils above the KT boundary, right? You just don't find them. Like the kind of dinosaurs that there aren't any above. So all the fossils we have are at that boundary or below. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean they all died
Right.
before it. Most of them died afterwards, but lots of them were entombed in this catastrophic event at that period. That's the last fossil horizon we have for them. So the ones that died after that died on the surface and, still very interesting. Okay. Is it break time?
Yes, it is. 33 minutes.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. The Snake Bros Institute for Advanced Coprolite Studies. Here in the Tangent Cube of Science, finishing up the Path of the Pole by Charles Hapgood. And I guess we're in the... this is the
final
conclusion.
bits.
The conclusion is over.
No. We're still looking at the fossil record. The conclusion is the next chapter, which we're almost there.
Gotcha.
And this is the part I was talking about, the gaps in the fossil record.
Aha.
One further point remains for our consideration. A feature of the fossil record that greatly impressed Darwin was the curious way in which species appear full-blown, with no indication of transition forms, much like the mythical birth of Venus. The paleontologist suddenly comes upon a species or a whole group of them, which have not been found before. They are all fully evolved. They obviously have long histories. There must have been hundreds or even thousands of ancestral forms for them, but absolutely no trace of the preceding forms can be found. It happened this way with the dinosaurs, which appeared in Africa, with a great many species already fully developed at the beginning of the Mesozoic era. They seem to have come literally out of nothing. Sometimes ancestral forms of a particular plant or animal will be found at a great distance, on another continent perhaps, but always there appear to have existed many intermediary links which have been lost. Even in the case of the horse, where an unusually good record exists, there are many missing links. A part of the reason for this situation is, of course, the imperfect preservation of the fossil record. There appear to be several reasons for this. Fossilization itself is a very rare event. Very few individuals of any species are preserved, and the great majority of all the species that have existed have disappeared without a trace. Then, of the fossils that were preserved in the rocks since the beginning of the sedimentary record, about 95% have been destroyed, since about that percentage of all the sedimentary rocks of the older periods has been eroded away and redeposited, with consequent destruction of all fossils. Finally, of the fossils that have been preserved, it is very unlikely that paleontologists can have seen and studied more than a very insignificant proportion. Let us say, to put the matter as liberally as possible, that they may have seen 1/1,000,000th of the existing fossils. Many of the latter, of course, are buried deep in the earth or under numerous shallow seas and will never be seen. So there you go. Most of them are never fossilized, and then of the ones that are fossilized,
Most of them are destroyed.
95% of sedimentary rocks since the beginning of sedimentation has been destroyed. And then out of what's left of that, less than 1/1,000,000th has ever been seen by anyone.
That's crazy. No, by paleontologists.
Paleontologists. I would say 1/1,000,000th has ever been seen by anyone, and paleontologists have seen like
Even
1%
less
of
than
that. Yeah. But as true as this is, it does not quite satisfy. Relatively few and scattered as fossils may be, it is still to be wondered at that we do not have a respectable handful of reasonably complete life histories. The light cast on this matter by the theory of crust displacement is quite startling. We have seen that such movements would necessitate frequent migrations of whole faunas and floras. It would necessarily follow from the theory of crust displacement that species would, as a rule, be separated by considerable geographical distances from the places of their origin. This would be all the more certain since the rate of development of new forms is probably very slow as compared with the rate at which crust displacements may occur. It could actually be rather seldom that one plant or animal would complete much of its life history in the same place. The missing links would usually have been separated by great geographical distances from the homes of their descendants. Moreover, the successive movements of the crust, with the resulting changes in the distribution of land and sea, would leave much of the fossil record under the present shallow or even deep seas and out of our reach. So that is interesting. If you take into account that the crust is moving, which requires lots of migration, massive migration of animals to stay in their habitable zones over periods of displacement, then you would take them out of the places where they're doing evolution. And so you may separate them by thousands of miles from their actual ancestor forms, which would not be expected without the idea of crustal displacement.
Right. But didn't he, earlier in the book, went through all these out-of-place fossils, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Where they're in places that are way too cold or way too warm or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now. Way too cold or way too warm now.
Now.
Yeah.
Right.
Part 8, summary. To sum up, it would seem that in crust displacement we have the missing factor that can bring all the other evolutionary factors into proper focus and correct perspective. By crust displacements, we may accelerate the tempo of natural selection, provide the conditions of isolation and competition required for change in life forms, and account for periods of revolutionary change, for the distribution of species across oceans and climatic zones, and for the extinction of species. We may also account for the significant association of turning points in evolution with geological and climatic changes, presenting them as different results of the same cause. But for crust displacements to have had these effects, and if they are indeed to account for the evolution of species, they must have occurred very often throughout the history of the Earth. Okay, final chapter, conclusion. In this book, I have presented a highly detailed mass of material, and I have sought to relate it to a single, essentially simple hypothesis. It now remains to summarize the evidence and the arguments for the hypothesis. We have seen that the problem of the geographical stability of the poles has long been a vexatious matter for science. From time to time, theories of polar shift have been advanced, supported by large quantities of evidence, but the proposed mechanisms have been found defective, and in consequence, the theories have been rejected. The failure of the theories has led in the following years to neglect of the evidence or to its analysis in accordance with theories conforming to the doctrine of the permanence of the poles. Although all the older theories of polar change have been discredited, the evidence in favor of polar change has constantly increased. As a consequence, many writers at the present time are discussing polar shift, but none of them has as yet suggested an acceptable mechanism. The general evidence for displacements of the lithosphere is exceedingly rich. In turn, the assumption of such displacements serves to solve a wide range of problems such as the causes of ice ages, warm polar climates, mountain building, and it provides a mechanism that may account for changes in the elevation of land areas and in the topography of the ocean floors. It also provides a basis for the resolution of conflicts in isostatic theory. For the period of the late Pleistocene, the theory permits the construction of a chronology of polar shifts with 3 successive tentative polar positions in the Yukon, the Greenland Sea, and Hudson Bay, preceding the present position of the pole. The evidence for the location of the Hudson Bay region at the pole during the last North American Ice Age is overwhelming, and this fact in itself provides the principal support for the assumption of the earlier shifts. The tempo of change indicated for the late Pleistocene is reflected in evidence from earlier geological periods. The theory is able to explain not only the general succession of climatic changes in various parts of the world in the late Pleistocene, it can also account for the detailed history of the last North American ice cap. It can explain the fluctuations of that ice cap, its repeated retreats and advances. It shows that the effects of volcanism may have been responsible for the oscillations. It shows also that these same effects, added to the effects of gradual climatic change, may account for the widespread extinctions of species at the end of the Pleistocene. And from this, we may assume that the same cause may have been responsible for numerous extinctions in earlier geological periods. By providing a reasonable basis for the assumptions of rapid climatic change and rapid topographical change, the theory provides solutions for many problems in the evolution and distribution of species. Our theory of displacement depends upon 2 assumptions and on 2 only. One of these is that an unbalanced mass within the lithosphere is exerting a sufficient centrifugal effect. The other assumption is that at some point below the crust, a weak layer exists that will permit the displacement of the crust over it. The body of geological evidence presented in this book provides very strong indirect support for both of these assumptions. As to the mechanics of displacements, Campbell has provided the necessary constructions. To some, the simplicity of his thought may be unnerving, but I feel assured that in the end, this simplicity itself will be the justification for reposing wide confidence in this theory. For it appears that no principle or no recondite principle can vitiate it. What is he saying there? No obscure idea can... spoil it. Okay, so who can argue with formulas so simple that a high school student can and usually does master them? In addition to the support provided by the evidence from the field, our theory receives support from logic. It has been recognized that one characteristic of sound new theories is the simplicity of their basic assumptions, and another is their capacity to explain a greater number of facts or a greater range of problems than previous theories. It was the simplicity of this theory that first aroused the interest of Einstein, in whose philosophy of science simplicity was a prime consideration. It appeared to him also that it might explain a far greater number of facts than were explainable by the various theories that have been produced to explain the leading problems of the Earth separately. Okay, part 2, remaining problems and future research. I am conscious of the many problems that remain to be solved, especially that of the mechanism of displacement. These are intensified by the assumptions I have been forced to make regarding the speed and recent date of some of these displacements. Many difficulties, some real and some fictitious, will confront this theory as they do any new and far-reaching assumption. An immediate problem, which, however, is soluble, relates to the geomagnetic evidence for some recent displacements. Some of this has been presented in this book, but admittedly it is insufficiently precise. I am sure that more evidence will be forthcoming, and if more evidence is to be found, it must first be looked for. Perhaps a good place to look for it would be in Iceland, which is situated with reference to the locations of our assumed poles in such a way that maximum changes in magnetic directions would have accompanied the polar shifts. Other possibilities for research suggest themselves. The following is an incomplete list. 1. Since the Ross Sea cores were lifted in 1949, no attempt has been made to date other cores in the same way to confirm or revise the results. This is a surprising oversight that should be remedied. I think this has been done since then, though, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, 1949. I mean, I know we've been, well, maybe not in Antarctica, though. That's the Ross Sea is. So he says, this reflects the lethargy regarding the basic questions of geological theory. It is important to date many more such cores from all around the coasts of Antarctica, not only to establish the facts regarding a possible warm period there, but also to determine whether climatic changes affected different parts of the continent in the sequence required by our hypothetical polar succession.
I mean, they have sediment cores. I mean, here's a story about sediment cores reveal Antarctica's warmer past. This is 2008 paper. Drilling project.
Oh, yeah,
in the
you're right.
Western
He's
Ross
talking about the
Sea.
sea cores. Yeah, not ice cores, but coring from the sea bottom. I see.
A unique drilling project in the Western Ross Sea has revealed that Antarctica had a much more eventful climate history than previously assumed.
Okay, yeah.
A new sediment core hints that the western part of the now frozen continent went through prolonged ice-free phases, presumably offering a glimpse of where our warming world might be headed. 2008 article in Nature.
Okay. So, 2, a determined effort should be made to establish beyond question the time of the end of the Sangamon interglacial period in North America. And 3, a project should be organized to carry out the dating by radiocarbon of several thousand samples of wood and animal remains from the circumpolar permafrost areas of the Arctic in order to find out whether the climatic changes followed the pattern from our assumed polar succession, and perhaps to determine the speed of the displacements more accurately. 4, studies of the age of the Antarctic ice should be planned to provide evidence confirming or revising the presumed polar succession. In some areas, the bottom ice should be much older than in others, and the ages should be in line with our assumptions regarding the various polar shifts. 5, there is at present no world map of gravity anomalies from which it might be possible to calculate the tangential stresses now active in the lithosphere. I think that we do have that now. This should be compiled, though it would be a large task, and the results processed by computers. If the results should indicate a net tangential stress in the same direction as the present indicated movement of the North Pole toward Greenland, one might assume the possibility of a connection between them. 6, Benioff has pointed out that during the 20th century there has been an ascending curve of major earthquakes of unexplained origin. These have apparently tended to increase both in intensity and frequency. An investigation should be undertaken to determine whether this ascending curve is related to the possible acceleration of the secular displacement of the pole, which I have referred to in Chapter 1. If they are connected, it may follow that earthquakes are caused by movements of the lithosphere. 7, extensive studies are necessary in connection with every observed isostatic anomaly of significant magnitude on the Earth's surface, whether positive or negative, to determine the tangential component of its gross centrifugal or centripetal effect. A computer should be utilized to determine the direction of any net horizontal stress that might affect the stability of the lithosphere. In this isostatic study, the triaxial distortions of the geoid should not be excluded from the calculations.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
Can't exclude the triaxial geo somethings.
Right. I mean, that's obvious. 8. Studies should be directed to the question of whether opposing centrifugal or centripetal effects of isostatic anomalies may not be factors in seismicity. For example, it is known that the Hawaiian Islands constitute an enormous mass of basalt, superposed on the Earth's crust but not compensated isostatically. Their low latitude implies that the centrifugal effect which the Earth's rotation exerts on their mass is enormous. It is mathematically certain that the tangential component of this effect acting in an equatorward direction must transmit a significant stress to the floor of the Pacific. Results of this stress should be apparent, and it may be possible to identify specific seismic phenomena with this source. 9. The assumption of a displacement of the Earth's crust at the end of the Ice Age carries the corollary of numerous changes in the elevation of various land masses with reference to sea level. Some of these changes of elevation may have been drastic. Evidence exists of such changes, but it is limited to only a few areas, and the observations are incomplete and imprecise. A world survey of such recent geological changes is required, but it is a task for many geologists that will take much time. Let me say a final word to the students, the young men and women in our colleges and high schools. The mysteries of the earth beckon to you. What man now knows is little enough, and most of his general concepts in every field are vitiated by the artificial concepts he has created to cover his ignorance. These concepts must be destroyed. One tool exists that can accomplish this destruction, and this tool is in your hands. It is simply curiosity, the instinct to ask and to question. It should be kept sharp and used without mercy.
That's awesome. I thought he was going to say the scientific method.
Yeah, you
Is
just
the tool.
be curious.
Yeah, be curious.
Ask questions.
That's even more base.
Merciless.
Merciless curiosity. Yes.
Okay, so in the following notes, appendices, and various things, I've got some marks here. There's lots of great stuff in here. So this, I may have read this earlier, but it's good to go through it again. It's short. Letters from Albert Einstein. So this was sent to him on November 24th, 1952. Dear Sir, I have read already some years ago in a popular article about the idea that eccentric masses of ice accumulated near a pole could produce, from time to time, considerable dislocations of the floating rigid crust of the Earth. I have never occupied myself with this problem, but my impression is that a careful study of this hypothesis is really desirable. I think that our factual knowledge of the underlying facts is at present not precise enough for a reliable answer based exclusively on calculations. Knowledge of geological and paleontological facts may be of decisive importance in the matter. In any case, it would not be justified to discard the idea a priori as adventurous. The question whether high pressure may not be able to produce fusion of nuclei is also quite justified. So this is interesting. Did he ask him about this?
I don't know.
He just changes subjects here. And it seems to me like the implication is that Hapgood was asking about pressure causing fusion. It is not known to me if a quantitative theory has been worked out by astrophysicists. The action of pressure would not be a static effect, as classical mechanics would suggest, but a kinetic effect, corresponding not to temperature, but to degeneracy of gases of high density. You should correspond about this with an astrophysicist experienced in quantum theory, such as Dr. M. Schwarzschild at the Princeton University Observatory. Sincerely yours, Albert Einstein. And here's another one he sent him in 1953. Dear Mr. Hapgood, I thank you very much for the manuscript that you sent me on May 3rd. This is sent May 8th. So he read it. I guess he got it on the 8th and he read it. Or I'm sorry, he got it on the 3rd and he was writing to him about reading the whole thing by the 8th. I find your arguments very impressive and have the impression that your hypothesis is correct. One can hardly doubt that significant shifts of the crust of the Earth has taken place repeatedly and within a short time. The empirical material you have compiled would hardly permit another interpretation. It is certainly true, too, that ice is continually deposited in the polar regions. These deposits must lead to instability of the crust when it is not sufficiently weak to constantly keep in balance by the adjustment of the polar regions. The thickness of the ice cap at the polar regions must, if this is the case, constantly increase, at least where a foundation of rock is present. One should be able to estimate empirically the annual increase of the polar ice caps. If there exists, at least in one part of the polar regions, a rock foundation for the ice cap, one should be able to calculate how much time was needed to deposit the whole of the cap. The amount of the ice that flowed off should be negligible in this calculation. In this way, one could almost prove your hypothesis.
Why? That's weird that he says that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because I thought it has like a slump, like it builds up and it just keeps like pushing.
Yeah, at first when I was reading this, I was thinking he's saying, so if there's a foundation of rock that will lock the ice to the crust, but that doesn't seem to be what he's talking about.
Even still, I mean, once the ice builds up high enough, it can slump away and push glaciers down valleys. And but I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about.
Another striking circumstance appears in connection with the ellipticity of the meridians. If, according to your hypothesis, an approximate folding of the meridional volume takes place, that is, folding of a meridional volume within an equatorial volume, which is considerably larger, this event will have to be accompanied by a fracture of the hard crust of the Earth. This also fits in very well with the existing phenomena of the volcanic coastal regions with their mainly north-south extension and the narrowness in the east-west direction. Without your hypothesis, one could hardly find a halfway reasonable explanation for these weak spots of the present-day crust of the Earth. Excuse me for not writing in English. My secretary has been away for some time, and spelling makes frightful difficulties for me. With sincere respect and kind regards, yours, Albert Einstein.
That's cool.
Okay. So there's a whole series of things here. He's going back and forth with James H. Campbell on the mechanics of the displacements, calculating the centrifugal effect of the ice cap. I'm going to skip all that stuff. So you guys should if you want to see this, get the book. There's lots of interesting stuff here where he's showing you how certain masses on the edge of on the surface of a sphere that's rotating or whatever will provide, and he's showing you how you can draw the line through the mass and thus determine the vector and the force and everything. So I'm going to skip to this though. The wedge effect. So this problem to be solved by the calculation was to find the quantity of the centrifugal thrust of the ice cap in terms of pressure per square inch on the Earth's crust, so that this quantity could be compared with the estimated tensile strength of the crust. If these quantities should be found to be of about the same magnitude, it would follow that the ice cap had the potentiality of bringing about the fracturing of the crust, which, because of the slightly oblate shape of the Earth, was necessary to its displacement over the lower layers. So again, because the Earth has this bulge, if the crust is going to move, there's going to be all this fracturing, right? So that's what they're talking about. Einstein, in a letter received during an early stage of the investigation, suggested that this necessity for the fracturing of the crust was the only serious hindrance to crust displacements in response to centrifugal effects. He wrote, quote, "For your theory, it is only essential that an eccentrically, I don't even know how to say that. Eccentrically situated mass rising above the mean level of the Earth's surface is producing a centrifugal momentum acting on the rigid crust of the Earth. The Earth crust would change its position through even a very small centrifugal force if the crust would be of spheric symmetry. The only force that I can see which can prevent such sliding motion of the crust is the ellipsotic form of the crust and of the fluid core. This form gives to the crust a certain amount of stability, which allows the dislocation of the crust only if the centrifugal momentum has a certain magnitude. The dislocation may then occur and be accompanied by breaking of the crust," right? So he's saying if it was a perfect sphere, it would actually move really easily. By any, any
small forces would
Right.
just make it slip all around.
Exactly. But because it isn't a perfect sphere, the whole crust moving requires a certain magnitude because it has to break the crust. But once it's got a certain magnitude, the only requirement is that it can actually break. So the only thing they basically come to this interesting conclusion that the only thing you have to check is what is the tensile strength, not the crush strength of the crust, but the tensile strength, which is much lower on rock, right?
Yeah, to split it apart.
Right. And if you can overcome that, then you can move the crust. There would be friction or whatever, but it's not that much, is their conclusion of this whole thing. Very interesting. So like you can basically ignore friction. There would be a little bit of friction, but really the biggest thing you have to overcome is the tensile strength of the crust of the Earth, which is not necessarily that high, relatively speaking. Also, it's already fractured all over the place, right? So it's... So Campbell, visualizing the sliding of the crust, perceived that a bursting stress would be caused in the crust when parts of it were displaced toward or across the equatorial region where the diameter of the Earth is greater. So there's a bunch of diagrams in here showing you that, and let's see if I marked this, but yeah, so they basically decide how much of it, here it is. So the reader will note, the equatorial bulge of the Earth is represented in this drawing as lying underneath the crust. The crust is not part of it. This is a new way of visualizing the bulge introduced by Campbell and justified by him on the ground that since the Earth's crust is of the same general thickness all over the Earth regardless of latitude, even though it may be of different thicknesses from place to place and under mountains, continents, and ocean basins, then the differences in the polar and equatorial diameters of the Earth are accounted for by differences in the thickness of layers underlying the crust. The bulge itself represents added material in the subcrustal layers in the equatorial regions. In other words, the bulge is not the crust, but the material underneath it.
Right.
So the bulge viewed in this way, as lying beneath the crust, forms two wedges against which the crust has to be displaced by the centrifugal thrust. So it's a wedge that starts at 0 at the poles and goes upwards as you go towards the equator, right? So if you just look at a cross section of the Earth, you see a wedge on both sides.
Right, like if you drew a perfect circle inside of it, you see this wedge on either side.
Yes, that's the wedge that has to be overcome. And there's like lots of very basic physics about wedges.
Wedgies?
Very basic physics about wedgies. Campbell reached the conclusion that to estimate the bursting stress produced on the crust in the equatorial region, it would be necessary to apply the mechanical principle of the wedge, which has the effect of multiplying the effect of an applied force. This principle is usually given as follows, quote, "The wedge is a pair of inclined planes united by their bases. In the application of pressure to the head or butt end of a wedge to cause it to penetrate a resisting body, the applied force is to the resistance as the thickness of the wedge is as to its length." So in other words, instead of even thinking of the crust rolling over it, you can view it as the wedge being pressed into the crust, right? And this actually has a magnifying effect on the force in terms of splitting it.
Right.
So this statement means that a wedge multiplies the splitting power or bursting stress produced by an applied force in the proportion of the length of the wedge to the thickness at the butt end. The length of the wedge in this case is about 6,000 miles. And its thickness at the butt end is 6.67 miles, so the ratio is roughly 1,000 to 1.
Which is very slight.
Right, but that's the amount of magnification of the force to burst the crust. It's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. I'm just thinking like if you had a really steep one, it's much harder.
That's right.
So
you got
really
this
nice,
long,
thin,
narrow wedge. It massively magnifies the force applied at the butt end of it to split the object that it's going through. That's what that's what's so crazy about this is you see that this equatorial bulge is actually not causing that much of a problem here. It's interesting. Like because
it
there's
creates stability, but it also can create this fracturing because of the low tensile.
Right. Because there's a bulge, you have to overcome the fracturing of the crust, but the bulge itself acts like a wedge that massively increases the force applied. Yeah. The force being applied. Yeah. So, okay. So, but then he says, The quantity of the thrust of the ice cap should be consequently multiplied by 1,000. However, there are two wedges, one on each side of the Earth, and therefore the thrust is multiplied only 500 times. So the physics basically says you have to combine the two wedges, right? So not 1,000 to 1, but 500. Nevertheless, the significance of such a multiplication of the effect of the ice cap is self-evident. I thought that was fascinating. There's a whole bunch of diagrams in here showing you about where he's showing you the work that he did on this. And this is all, he's basically saying, well, this is how you can look at this in terms of physics. You hang a weight, all this stuff. It's very interesting. Okay, so I do have some more marked, but are we already out of time here? Yeah.
Yes, for this segment we are.
Okay. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, Brothers of the Serpent podcast. And we're continuing with the notes in the appendices of the Path of the Pole book. I love this idea of the simplification of the idea that you can look at the bulge of the Earth as a wedge. I really do love that.
That is cool.
But there's more interesting stuff in here. So note number 5 here is notes of a conference with Einstein. So in January of 1955, Campbell, who is the guy that did all the physics with the wedges of the Earth here.
I have to say one thing about the wedge, though, real quick, that it's also even more effective because the thing that it's wedging underneath is also being assisted by the centrifugal force of the thing that's causing the wedge to exist in the first place.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff in here about the physics of this, and Hapgood actually. Well, we'll get to it. So in 1955, Campbell and I had the privilege of a conference with Einstein, at which a number of important questions relating to the theory were discussed. Subsequently, I prepared the following statement, which I submitted to him for his approval. He approved it as an accurate report of our discussion, but he desired that it should not be interpreted as an official endorsement on his part of Campbell's calculations in detail, which he had had insufficient opportunity to study. Those present at the meeting included Dr. Einstein, Mr. Campbell, Mrs. Mary G. Grand, and myself. So here we go. This is the statement or the quotation. After the introductory remarks, Mr. Hapgood explained to Dr. Einstein that while in the development of the theory, he had himself been concerned mainly with the field evidence in geology and paleontology, Mr. Campbell had contributed to the basic concepts in mechanics and geophysics. Mr. Hapgood explained further that Mr. Campbell's calculations had now advanced to a point where he felt that a consultation was necessary. The principal question was whether the tangential portion of the centrifugal effect resulting from the rotation of the ice cap was of the correct order of magnitude to cause fracturing of the Earth's rigid crust. Dr. Einstein had stated in a letter to Mr. Hapgood that owing to the oblate shape of the Earth, the crust could not be displaced without fracturing, and that the tensile strength of the crust opposing such fracturing was the only force he could see that could prevent a displacement. He had already suggested, therefore, that it would be necessary to compare the bursting stresses proceeding from the ice cap with the available data on the strengths of the crustal rocks. It was this problem that now, through the calculations made by Mr. Campbell, seemed to be solved. Mr. Campbell explained to Dr. Einstein the principles he had followed in making the calculations. He used photostatic drawings as illustrations. He showed that the crust, in attempting to pass over the equatorial bulge of the Earth, would be stretched to a slight degree. A bursting stress would arise that would tend to tear the crust apart. This stress would, in all probability, exceed the elastic limit of the crustal rocks. That is, they would tend to yield by fracture if the stress was great enough. Dr. Einstein said yes, but he wondered how an equilibrium of force could be created or would be created. Mr. Campbell pointed out that two equal and opposite pressures would arise since, at the same time, on two opposite sides of the globe, two opposite sectors or quadrants of the crust would be attempting to cross the bulge. Dr. Einstein agreed that this was reasonable, but raised the question of the behavior of the semi-liquid underlayer of the bulge under pressure from the rigid crust. After some discussion, it was agreed that this underlayer, despite its lack of strength, would not be displaced because of the effect of the centrifugal momentum of the Earth. Mr. Kemp, so I think they're talking about what I think this section means is they discuss the idea that instead of the crust trying to fracture, would it actually want to push that material away? Would that material flow away? In other words, the wedge is made up of liquid. You see what I mean? So Einstein is saying, like, do we need to talk about this semi-liquid underlayer under pressure from the rigid crust trying to slide over this bulge? Would it actually just try to spread the bulge out? And they decided that this wouldn't happen, that the crust would fracture before it could push that material away. Mr. Campbell then explained the application of a principle by which the tangential stress proceeding from the ice cap was greatly magnified. He considered that the bulge of the Earth, starting with 0 thickness at the poles and approaching 6.67 miles in thickness at the equator, behaved physically as a wedge resisting the movement of the crust. Since the distance from the pole to the equator is about 6,000 miles, the ratio of this wedge is 1,000 to 1, but the existence of two wedges on opposite sides of the globe reduced the ratio to 500 to 1. The ice cap's tangential effect, multiplied by 500 and divided by the number of square inches of the cross-section of the lithospheric shell at the equator, produced a bursting stress on that shell of 1,738 pounds per square inch. So 1,738 psi. After examining each step in the argument twice, Dr. Einstein had the impression that the principles were right and that the effects were of the right order of magnitude. He stated that he would be satisfied if the bursting stress and the strength of the crust were in the ratio of not more than 1 to 100, since the crust varied so greatly in strength from place to place and would undoubtedly yield at its weakest point. Mr. Campbell explained an effect he had often observed, which illustrated the process by which the crust might yield to fracture. A common method of splitting a block of granite is to drill two small holes about 6 inches apart near the center of the long axis of the granite and insert and drive home a wedge in each hole. A bursting stress of sufficient magnitude is brought to bear to split the rock. However, the rock is not split all at once. Enough stress is brought to bear to start a fracture, but the fracture does not take place instantaneously. If the wedges are put in place in the evening, it will be found next morning that the whole rock has been split evenly along a line extending through the two holes. The fracture has slowly migrated through the rock during the night.
Well, it just made me think of like that it's cooling down at night too, and it's contrast. So there's even more forces being put on it.
Right. But this is similar to...
No, it's just a separate subject.
No, it's not. Because what I thought of was like on a windshield, you get a crack and then it will crawl very slowly.
For sure.
So this is the same thing that's happening here. But he's basically, the point that Campbell is making is that the force required to split rock in this way is only a fraction of what's required to split it all at once.
Yeah, gotcha.
Like, in other words, you just get it going. You don't have to pound them in really hard. Just get that split going and then just leave. You know? It's like Ty's method of cleaning house. We don't need to split this rock, bro. If we leave, when we come back, it'll be split. It'll be done.
Yeah. Magically. Just magic.
It's just magic. You don't need to clean the house. Just go away. When you come back, it'll be clean.
That's what I do.
Yes.
What you do.
So, what is required is not a force sufficient to split it all at once, but simply a force sufficient to initiate a fracture or fractures, which will then gradually extend themselves during possibly considerable periods of time. Mr. Hapgood next described the geological evidence of worldwide fracture systems extending through the crust and weakening it, and the remarkable similarity of these patterns to those which theoretically would result from a movement of the crust.
I wonder if this is like in part why when there's like massive granite outcrops and stuff that are obviously very old, that they have these quartz inclusions.
I'm sure, yeah.
Giant veins of quartz and stuff that are just running way down.
Yeah.
And all the different inclusions that they have from just being fractured and
then it gets
however
filled
long
in.
ago, then it gets filled with some new, some like silicates seep into it over time.
Yep.
That's really
And
cool.
they grow off of the existing quartz in the granite, right?
Yeah.
So Dr. Einstein expressed the keenest interest in this evidence, the evidence of the worldwide fracture system. Then Mr. Hapgood referred to the Urey findings of the dates of climatic change in Antarctica during the Pleistocene. Dr. Einstein stated that the method of radioactive dating developed by W.D. Urey was sound and reliable. As a result, Dr. Einstein was in full agreement that the data from Antarctica, indicating that that continent enjoyed a temperate climate at a time when a continental ice cap lay over much of North America, virtually compel the conclusion that a shift of the Earth's entire crust must have taken place. Dr. Einstein then asked Mr. Hapgood what objections geologists had been making to his theory. Mr. Hapgood replied that it was principally a question of the number of such movements. Urey's evidence would imply 4 such displacements at irregular intervals during the last 50,000 years. Dr. Einstein replied that this seemed to be a large number. However, he said, if the evidence could not be explained in any other way, then even this large number would have to be accepted. The gradualistic notions common in geology were, in his opinion, merely a habit of mind and were not necessarily justified by the empirical data. Mm-hmm. At this point, the discussion turned to astronomy. Mr. Hapgood did not understand why men who would boggle at the rate of change required by the theory of crustal movements thought nothing of accepting the view that the entire universe had been created in half an hour. Dr. Einstein said that, unfortunately, the evidence seemed to point that way. After considerable discussion, he added that it was not, however, necessary to take the present state of our knowledge very seriously. Future developments might show us how to reach different conclusions from the evidence. Much that we regard as knowledge today may someday be regarded as error. I love that. Einstein says not to take our present state of knowledge very seriously. Yeah. That's fantastic.
That's great.
That's like one of the foundational principles of this podcast. We know
Manual
almost nothing.
for the Universe, final edition.
That's right. Toward the end of the interview, Dr. Einstein indicated a number of points where further research would be desirable. He suggested the need for a gravitational study of the Antarctic continent and for a study of the rates of crustal adjustment to increasing or decreasing loads of ice. He commented on the difficulties that confront those who wish to introduce new theories and quoted Planck's remark that theories change not because anyone gets converted, but because those who hold the old theories eventually die off. Okay. So note number 4, the mechanics of centrifugal effect. I've got a few more marks here and then we'll be done with the book. So the existence of a very common misunderstanding regarding the mechanics of the Earth's rotation, particularly related to the problem of the stability of the poles, was made clear to me by a difference of opinion that arose at the beginning of my inquiry. Brown, whose work was the starting point of my own, was an engineer, and his concepts of the Earth's motions were based upon simple mechanics. He understood gyroscopic action and the stabilizing role of the rim of a rotating flywheel. He also understood the laws of centrifugal effect as applied to weights eccentric to the axis of the spin of rotating bodies. It was my good fortune that Campbell, who was to carry the work forward, was also a mechanical engineer. Brown had made the statement that it was the equatorial bulge of the globe that stabilized it with reference to the axis of rotation. He compared it to the rim of a flywheel. I found that this statement was disputed by some physicists. The physicists suggested that the stability of the Earth on its axis was not owing to the centrifugal effect of the rotation of the equatorial bulge alone, but to that of the rotation of the entire mass of the Earth. But Maxwell suggests that in the absence of the equatorial bulge, any change in the crust, meaning, it is clear, the creation of any protuberance or excess weight at any point, would change the position of the planet on its axis of rotation. So I spent some time thinking about this, and it actually, that's right. Because it's a sphere, if you get it spinning, it doesn't have axial stability. because it's uniform.
Right.
So you put the slightest instability or change in the outer edge of it, and that's gonna right.
That's gonna want to be at the equator.
That's fascinating. Yeah. That basically, like, the whole idea of complete overturning of the axis, the whole planet flipping over, is not. It's only the bulge that keeps this from happening. In other words, because we've said, in other words, what I'm trying to say is I've got this wrong multiple times throughout the podcast, because we talked about the whole mass of the Earth having to be shifted, but that isn't right.
Yeah.
It's just the mass of this bulge, which isn't that much relative to the entire mass of the planet.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Especially when you consider the fact that the planet isn't solid.
That's what I'm talking about.
A lot of times we think of, you think of a rotating sphere, it's like a metal ball.
Yeah.
But our planet is like this squishy, it's
to get that thing to completely flip over on its axis is different, like a solid ball.
No, even that is the axis isn't stable. He continues here on this, and they did some experiments. Yeah, it's really interesting. So Hapgood says, even before I located this passage in Maxwell, a peculiar device designed by Brown had made this principle clear to me by observation. This device consisted of a globe mounted on 3 trunnions in such a way that it could rotate in any direction. So
what is a trunnion?
The rings that...
Okay, yeah.
Right? I looked it up, but it's like any axial support.
Yeah,
a pin or pivot forming...
Three axes.
Right, a pin or pivot...
get it spinning one way, and you can, like, flip it around on the other axes.
The globe is mounted just like a regular Earth globe. It's got a pinion, one that are mounted on the globe's polar axis. But then you can mount another one 90 degrees to that, but you mount it on the pinion supports.
Right.
And then you mount another one 90 degrees to that so that it's free rotation in any direction, right? I'm sorry, trunnions.
Trunnions.
The pins are holding the trunnions in.
We need to get one of these.
Yeah. So the device consists of a globe mounted on 3 trunnions in such a way that it can rotate in any direction. The globe was a perfect sphere and had no equatorial bulge. It was suspended by a string to an overhead point. To rotate this sphere, all that was necessary was to wind it up and let it go. So I think they wound it up by you rotate it until the string gets... Mm-hmm. Brown had a weight attached to the south pole of the sphere, and it was observable that as soon as the sphere began to rotate rapidly, the weight was flung to the equator, where it stabilized the direction of rotation as long as the speed of rotation was maintained. Later, Campbell made a larger model of Brown's device, which I rotated unweighted, and observed that it had no stable axis of spin. 2 motions were observable, a rapid rotation and a slow, random drifting.
Wow.
And that's true. Like, I've thought of it. You get it spinning.
Because it gets this equal distribution of mass all around.
Yeah, so it like the slightest little things, like atmosphere, air hitting it, will just the whole thing will turn. Right? So it's spinning really fast, but the whole axis is just doing this randomly.
Wow, I have to see this. We have to get one of these.
Yeah.
If it was metal, we can just stick little magnets to it.
Right. It was evident that the mass of the sphere acted as a stabilizer of the speed of rotation, but had no influence on its direction.
Wow.
And that's like suddenly made sense to me, because it's a sphere. It's equal. The distribution is equal, so the axis can't be supported. The only thing
it's not clear to me.
Okay.
Because if you think about the mass in terms of centrifugal force at the pole, right? There's nothing near the pole.
Yeah, there's nothing that locks the axis of rotation to any particular place on the sphere, because the sphere is equal in all directions. So it can drift slowly through it. Does that not make sense?
I'm just thinking of the angular momentum of the equator of the sphere.
Yeah.
Right, being all of that mass that's out here that's actually in motion, whereas like the closer you get to the pole,
right, there's less motion there, right? But because it's like,
so then to try to change the direction of all this mass, centrifugal force,
right? So
seems like
with no outside forces, 0 outside forces, it will not change. But the slightest thing can change it, because there's not You see what I'm saying? That's the point. The slow random drifting is caused by friction of air and whatever. I think that's what's happening here. In other words, it isn't stable along the axis.
Right.
It probably is stable given zero outside forces. But the point that this is making to me is that if you have a perfect sphere, then the slightest thing can actually shift the axis of rotation. Not crustal displacement, the whole axis, the entire object.
Right.
But you give it the slightest bit of equatorial bulge, in other words, add some weight somewhere, and then now it suddenly becomes stable.
More stable,
Yeah. Yeah.
He said this became clear upon his observation of this device. That's what I want.
Two motions were observable, a rapid rotation and a slow random drifting. It was evident that the mass of the sphere acted as a stabilizer of the speed of rotation but had no influence on its direction. This experiment, strongly confirming Brown's claim, encouraged me to persist until I could find positive theoretical confirmation of the observation, which eventually I did in the works of Maxwell. And Maxwell said that in the absence of the equatorial bulge, any change of the crust would change the position of the planet on its axis of rotation.
Holy shit. Except, wouldn't you have to include the moon in this model? Not just the equatorial
Yeah, so the
bulge.
moon would be an outside force too, yeah. I think they're talking about just the Earth by itself, considering it by it's spinning in space with no outside forces.
And no bulge.
Right.
It'd be easy to move the whole axis.
Yeah. So I was amazed in this connection to note a phenomenon which, nevertheless, is as old as science itself. The professors, most of them at any rate, would not come to see this device.
Oh.
In view of continued skepticism, I could not be entirely satisfied by the Maxwell statement, supported though it might be by this demonstration. Since I am not myself a physicist, I felt it not unlikely that some persons would conclude that in the first place I had misunderstood Maxwell, and that in the second place I was incapable of interpreting correctly the evidence of my eyes. I therefore wished to obtain an authoritative interpretation of Maxwell's statement, and accordingly I wrote Dr. Harlow Shapley, the director of the Harvard Observatory, as follows. Quote, after a year of intensive work with a group of people here, I have concluded that the work we are doing is dependent upon a clear answer to the question as to whether the geographical poles are stabilized by the momentum of the rotation of the Earth or solely by that of the equatorial bulge. I have had discussions about this with Dr. Adams of the Coast and Geodetic Survey and with Dr. Clements of the Naval Observatory. They have given me references to the work of Clerk Maxwell and others without quite satisfying me. I am not, of course, equipped to understand all of the technicalities, but I am hoping that you can give me a steer in non-technical terms on the general concepts. My hunch is that, contrary to widespread impressions, it is the bulge alone that stabilizes the geographical poles. As I reasoned it out, if the Earth were a perfect sphere, the energy of its rotation derived from its mass and motion would stabilize the speed of the rotation, but would have no reference to the direction. If we suppose that someone could reach out from Mars with a pole and give the Earth a strong push at an angle of 90 degrees from the direction of rotation, the Earth would be shifted on the axis of rotation to an extent determined by the ratio of the force of the push to the mass of the Earth. Wow. In fact, if the Earth had no bulge, it would never have stable poles, but would rotate in every which way.
Wow.
If my view of the matter is sound, important consequences follow, but I am not quite certain of the validity of my premise. And then Dr. Shapley's reply, dated February 2nd, 1951, was in part as follows. Dr. Harold Jeffries was fortunately here at the observatory, and I could turn over your inquiry to him. I now have his reply. He says, in effect, that the fullest discussion of the points mentioned by you is in Ruth's Rigid Dynamics, probably in Volume 1. Most textbooks of rigid dynamics will have something about it. The theory goes back to Euler. Really, both the rotation and the equatorial bulge are needed to maintain stability. Without rotation, the body could be at rest in any position. With rotation, but without the equatorial bulge, it could rotate permanently about an axis in any direction. With this statement, I decided to rest content. It seemed to me that Brown's position in the matter was correct. Maxwell showed both by the use of his dynamical top and theoretically what Brown showed by his device that a rotating sphere tends to throw the heaviest weights on its surface to the equator of spin. Maxwell and, after him, George H. Darwin recognized that the equatorial bulge of the globe stabilized the direction of the Earth's rotation, just as a weight on the surface of a model sphere would do when the sphere was rotated rapidly.
That's cool. That's totally making me rethink precession. Like,
Yeah.
if the stabilization of the pole position relative to the sun, for example, is due to like mostly the bulge,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit to the moon, which is a little off axis as well,
Yeah.
then yeah, I mean, why? It seems like you don't need any outside force like Sirius or some binary star system or something like that to explain precession.
It's not very stable.
It's not stable,
Yeah.
and yet there's some particular imbalance. Could even be these giant blobs
Yep.
that are inside, you know, the Earth and not centered,
Yeah.
causing this. It's almost like a stable wobble.
Yeah.
In a way, right? You would consider this like if it was actually moving in this circular motion, the pole was, then that's a stabilized wobble.
Yeah.
Compared to a sphere that could just randomly just move around.
And I mean, this might be way out there, but what if let's see.
And that explains too why it can go in the opposite direction of rotation.
Yeah.
Because I had wondered that, like when you got the gyroscope, and we were like, well, it always wants to go.
Yeah. It always wants to go in the direction of rotation, not opposite. It doesn't
Yeah.
want to precess.
But yeah,
Okay.
what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, like, could the crust just be doing that? Does it have
Well,
to be
but
the whole axis, or like how do we measure it?
Because apparently, like Vega was the North Star.
That's right. Because we check it on.
So the pole actually did have to point a different direction, and then of course you on the equinox, when the axis is tilted perpendicular to the direction of the sun, you're seeing a different constellation. So the pole has to be moving.
It has to be the entire axis, not
the
not
axis.
necessarily the geographical pole, but the
No.
whole axis of rotation. Yeah. So yeah, that is very interesting. That changes a lot of things about the stability of the rotation. It's all if any stability that exists is due to both the rotation, but also that there's this weight, this excess mass at the equator.
But this also brings the question. It makes me very uncertain about the idea that precession is a constant.
Sure.
Right? Like that's accepted that it may not be a constant.
Yeah. It's
velocity
not,
or
right.
whatever. So then we have the tilting, the change in the tilt is also happening. That's not precession.
Right.
But precession could have been, roughly what it's moving now is, if you make a whole circle out of it, you get 26,000 years. But if you go back 14,000 years, the rate that it was moving could have been 10,000 years long.
Right.
For the entire rotation.
Yeah.
Or 50,000 years.
Yeah. That's right.
And the nodding doesn't necessarily have to be cyclical either in this perfect manner. It could be it's just what we notice now.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's crazy. That just kind of throws it all up in the air.
The balance of the forces of rotation and gravity at every point of the Earth's surface can also be understood in this way. The shape of the Earth, as we have pointed out, is oblate. This means that as you go toward the equator, you are getting farther from the Earth's center. In a sense, therefore, you are going uphill. Likewise, when you are going toward the poles, you are getting closer to the Earth's center, and therefore you are going downhill. But we can all see that it takes no more energy to move toward the equator than it does toward a pole. Also, water in the ocean does not run downhill toward the poles. The Earth's surface acts as if it were perfectly level. The reason for this is that as you go toward the equator, going uphill, the centrifugal effect of the Earth's rotation increases just enough to compensate for the gradient. While if you move toward the poles, this centrifugal effect declines in proportion. The forces of gravity and rotation are therefore balanced, and no centrifugal effect will tend to propel a mass in this equipotential surface toward the equator, and no gravitational effect will tend to propel it toward the poles.
Wouldn't it be greater gravitational effect? Yeah, that's right. When you get to the equator, there's a
Farther away from center of mass.
there's a greater gravitational effect.
No.
No? Because there's more mass under you.
Yeah. But
But it's farther from the center.
right. I don't know. It's farther from the center, but there's more mass, but the increase in centrifugal effect is more
greater.
than the, because like,
So they
the amount
equal
of
out.
gravity is a very weak force. And
Yeah.
so he's basically saying that it's not, it isn't uphill both ways and all that, basically. And in fact, the earth is actually flat. Like,
Okay.
it's actually flat because it's a sphere. So the fact that the force of gravity is absolutely much greater than the centrifugal effect of the rotation is shown by the fact that the flattening of the Earth is very slight. The equatorial bulge amounts to 6.7 miles in comparison with the Earth's mean radius of 4,000 miles. This is a ratio of only 0.17%. So that's the last thing I have marked in there. There's a whole bunch
cool.
more, though. It's full of notes at the end. And then, of course, there's the massive bibliography after that, too. But
That's great stuff.
all that stuff about the, him checking on the physics and then talking to Einstein and then contacting these people. And I would love to get this.
Yeah, let's get one.
Get
We
this,
need that.
the sphere, yeah.
Along with, some palladium and some heavy water.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think, before we go, we just ran out of sand, but where do you stand on this idea of crustal shift at this point?
Well, I think I'm much more convinced that something like this can take place after going through the book. I don't know if it certainly doesn't. I think it needs to be combined with, like, so we talk about this with, like, what about solar stuff or the impacts? It's like they aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
I think all of it. If you have a massive solar eruption, that can cause a crustal shift or even an axial change. An impact can certainly overcome all the problems, like send cracks throughout the entire, and then the whole thing starts moving. So in other words, I think, to me, the clearest thing, I think, is that this needs to be incorporated into our view of the Earth's history and reasons for catastrophes. It isn't the only one. But just like we would view massive volcanism and earthquakes as a result of a huge impact, I think crustal shift would also be one. Right? And then he's also saying that showing how little amount of, like, relatively little amount of force is required, how little it requires to split the crust, which would result in slippage. You just have to overcome the crust's tensile strength. So any instability is going to result in stresses on the crust. If those stresses, the forces of those stresses, are greater than its tensile strength, it will tend to slip. That's the idea.
So you could have
There's
periods.
a whole couple of sections in that too, where he goes over all the isostasy stuff, and he shows, like, because people are saying, well, the ice builds up, but it sinks into the earth, and that.
Yeah, but then that has to push, like, the material underneath out.
Yes.
Away from it towards the bulge.
Right. But then he also shows all this interesting. There's this interesting data about, like, icebergs.
Which that could crack.
Icebergs in the ocean, and they go towards the equator. Because he's like, what happens? It's floating, but ice is lighter than the water. So a certain amount of the ice is sticking out of the water.
Yeah. And its centrifugal force is just
It's pushing that, the center of mass of that amount that's extended above towards the equator. Right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff about this. So there's all these different factors that come into it, like how much material built up on
Which is brilliant because, I mean, just cool because at the same time you have like this warm part and the cold part, and the cold part is like accumulating more and more, pushing it out, and then it breaks off, and then it naturally flows to the warm part and melts.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
He also
cool.
talks about, gliding versus, with the friction and all this stuff. And he's like, look, gliding is basically one of the most efficient ways to move something. It uses the least amount of force required for propelling something or moving it. And he talks about how people breaking up ice, like one man can move an enormous amount of this huge, massive block of ice. It's floating in water. Just one guy can reach out and you can push it and it will move because it's gliding in the water. It's mostly supported. This is the state of the crust over the semi-molten material below it. It's basically sitting on it's like ice
floating.
sitting in water. Yeah, it's really easy to move it no matter how heavy the ice is.
Right. Yeah, so I also agree with you that it needs to be looked into further. It needs to be considered as one of the possibilities of the changes that we see in the past. But also, I think it's still possible that we can go in and out of ice ages without this, happening. Like he kind of tries to make it explain everything, and I don't think that that's even necessary. It doesn't need to explain everything.
Right. So defining an ice age is the problem there, right? He was, at least the way I took it was that he was arguing against an idea that was powerful, maybe only in his time. I don't know if it's still considered this way, but like ice ball Earth, like that.
Yeah, for
that
sure.
The whole planet gets super cold, and he's like,
no.
Yeah. All these ice ages that seem to be in what are now tropics those were ice caps,
Right.
not ice ages. I think that's that seems more likely to me than the whole planet freezing for a long time, because that would just kill everything.
Right.
That's not just an extinction event. That's, a planet killer. Everything
how do you explain these extremely low levels of CO2 at those times then? Because if it was just moving and the ice that used to be there is melting in the oceans down in the tropics, and then there's new ice forming up at the poles, why does the CO2 level drop so drastically?
Yeah,
You're kind of exchanging.
That's a good question.
And then
because
you have sea level rise and fall, so you are exchanging like a lot of ice for
there's
water.
More or less ice, definitely.
So it doesn't. That's what
I mean,
saying.
on the one hand, an ice age can be described as permanent ice caps.
Yeah,
Right.
that's true.
If Earth has permanent ice caps, it's in an ice age. Right. This is a basic description of ice ages. It just like the strength of the ice age is dependent on how big the ice caps are. Have they ever expanded so much that they meet each other at the equator? I don't think so. Right. At least not. Maybe it did, but everything that lives here now would basically be evolved from whatever algae managed to survive that event.
He may have gotten really close.
But you're
in
also,
which case it was an iceberger.
an iceberg. But you're also right about the CO2 issue, because one of the things that should go along with massive crustal shift is enormous amounts of volcanoes, and that dumps massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Yeah, and as the ice,
then again, colder water can hold a lot more CO2.
Yeah, that's the point, right? Like it did cool down.
Yeah.
Like it cooled way down. So you're dumping a giant bucket of ice into the warm oceans, and then you're refreezing stuff where it's already cold.
Yeah.
So maybe you get a net cooling effect.
Yeah.
For a while. I don't know. I'm just, I guess I'm not convinced on all fronts. Like this is, this does explain it. But,
No, I don't think so.
But that it is something that is possible and may have occurred recently and should definitely be looked into further. But
for me, the main issue I had with it was the physics. I was just like, there's like all this friction, and there's, but really a lot of that stuff at the end, I was like, okay, this is much more a much more interesting way to look at it. That the bulge is basically acts like a wedge. You know, that's really interesting. The displacement, the displaced mass that is tending to push the crust or make it slide over the planet is like the hammer hitting the butt of the wedge. If that hammer hits the wedge strongly enough and the mathematics is right, it will start to split the material.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think that's really, really an interesting way to look at it. And maybe that was helped by the fact that I could see all the diagrams. So those of you listening that couldn't see some of the diagrams in there about, you know, you're thinking like, what? How is it a wedge? It's a bulge in a sphere.
It's kind of more like the way I'm imagining it. It's like the hammer is hitting the material into the knife edge, like the sharp edge of the wedge.
Right. Yes, it is confusing because the fat end of the wedge is down at the equator.
That's right.
Where the stuff is trying to go. But you can also look at it as like that wedge is sliding into the crust.
Right, yeah. You can just change it. Yeah. Change the motion.
The source of so basically what I could have said is like the hammer is hitting the material toward the point of the wedge. Yeah. Yeah.
For sure. And it's cracking it. And then you have to consider that whichever side is being pulled towards by the centrifugal force, the other side is pulling away.
Yeah.
And that's, again, the tensile strength.
Yeah.
So you're pushing a mass that has a really strong burst or crush strength.
Yeah.
And it doesn't crush, and you're pushing it towards something that's trying to break its tensile strength.
Right, which is weak.
Then you're pulling away on another section.
Yeah.
And that's all tensile. So that's also weak.
Right.
So you get fracturing on both sides.
Yes, that's right. I'm just saying that made it much more clear to me because you basically get the idea through their conversations that they're like, well, the friction is negligible. It isn't a factor because of the scales and the amount of mass of everything involved. That you can basically, you know, and I've taken enough physics classes where they're just like, pretend friction doesn't exist, right? You can do all the calculations because the amount of friction in this is so tiny that it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. So they're like, okay, so it's given the concept that the crust is a material that we can, in general, know the basic thickness of, and the basic tensile and crush strength of, and then we know the physics of rotating bodies, you know, gyroscopic, mechanical stability, and all this kind of stuff that you can kind of narrow it down. And you can say, well, it's actually very simple for this stuff to be unstable, to be not stable.
Yeah.
And all it requires is certain conditions. And we can say that given those certain conditions, this take place?
You got this unstable thing, so you stick a couple of wedges in there to hold it in place, and then somebody throws a freaking baseball at it.
Right. Yeah.
I get it. Yeah,
it just became
cool.
Yeah. And even the idea at the end there that really the axis is only stabilized by this tiny bulge.
I have to have that device.
Yeah.
I want to see this for myself.
Yeah.
Not that I don't trust these guys, but I want to play with this device or this gadget.
Yeah. It's really interesting because, you know, I mean, obviously the Earth can't really be modeled by a metal ball.
No, but
you can
infer.
You can see the basic principle of the instability of an axis on a rotating sphere, if this is true, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so it is very interesting. I'm just saying that
if you simplify the Earth down to like this perfectly homogeneous, perfect sphere, it should, with no moon and no these.
Yeah.
I mean,
I guess what I'm saying is if a spinning metal sphere has no axial stability or very little axial stability, then the fact that the Earth isn't a metal sphere and is not totally homogeneous just means that it has a little more axial stability, but not much. In other words, that's what I'm saying is that the great mass of the Earth itself is not giving stability to the axis.
Right.
That's the most important.
Especially when other things are in proportion.
Yes. Right.
So something like the moon can definitely affect
Yeah.
whatever is going on with the Earth's rotational axis.
Yeah.
We know the moon has been nailed
Yeah.
really hard
Yeah.
by something, a lot of things. That's really interesting, man. That's great stuff at the end there.
Yeah.
This book never fails
Yeah.
to really get the gears turning.
Yep. So hope you guys enjoyed that 11-part series.
Yeah. I did.
All you part 11ers, you guys are
The 11ers, man. You're
11ers,
still
you
here
guys
with
are
us.
serious. Screw all those 7ers we were talking about that left after 7. The
7ers?
The 11ers are the serious ones here. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Let's take a break.
Already. And we're back, ladies and gentlemen, the final segment where we have some small talk, get to know each other before we get into the serious topics of the next show.
That's right.
If you listen to the shows back to back, it makes no difference whether we put this segment at the beginning or the end.
That's right. There's just a lag.
Yeah. For sure. Look what I have here.
Oh, yeah.
I have
What are they made out of?
vinyl.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
It's not like,
these are the...
it's not like printed on nickel or something.
No. This is not the master.
Okay.
This is just a, a proof press of the album. So it doesn't have our
Doesn't
sticker.
have the graphics.
Doesn't have our artwork on it, but I need to grab one of those tables
Yeah.
you got and bring it down here and hook it up.
Let me see it.
Yeah, bro. It's going to be a double album. I got 2 of them here. Really excited about it. Got the vinyl proofs, so got to give them a listen. Byman already said he listened to it. It does sound quite different from the digital version.
Yeah, I bet.
And in a good way, so I hear. So can't wait to give it a listen. Also,
Is it 3 songs?
it's 3 songs per side. So
That's a very short song in the middle there.
in the vinyl version, This Is War and Deus are basically one song,
Yeah.
as they were originally
Right, okay.
written. It's like the song and then the outro. So that might just be a silent part. I don't know.
There's 2 of them.
Yeah, who knows, bro? We'll have to hook it up to the tables and see.
Yeah.
Anyway, super glad to get this, and we are working on new music. Byman's been recording some draft drums. Ty's working on some stuff. I've been working on a lot of stuff. GMA just got the interface hooked up at his garage, so we're all remote and sharing stuff that we're working on, and it's great. So that's the-
GMA's recording in his garage?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, it's bass. It's it's DI, direct in, so no big deal.
Yeah.
Excellent!
And then tomorrow we're bottling
Yeah.
roughly, probably a little less than 600 cases of the 2020.
600. Okay.
What did I tell you?
I thought it was 300 cases.
No, bro.
600 cases.
6.
Yeah. I told somebody the wrong number, then they asked me the other day.
Yeah, well, I kind of went for a large lot, so we blended pretty much everything.
Yeah.
The cab, my opinion, wasn't releasable by itself. The Monty would have been. We released 100 cases of the Monty by itself, but this is
The cab was
a little green.
not quite ripe enough.
So it's good though, and it's good blended. And I just tasted the blend today. It's in tank, and we're meeting at the winery at 7 in the morning to get everything cleaned and hooked up and ready to go and bottling.
Yeah, so
600 cases.
if this episode came out late, you know why.
Yeah, that's why.
Because the day I'm supposed to be would normally publish the show, we're gonna be bottling all day. So
We probably finish early, 1 o'clock or something, maybe earlier. Anyway, so we'll have, and then that's going to sit, in bottle for 6 weeks at least.
yeah,
So we'll be releasing it in March at some point.
all right.
Looking forward to that. And we're pruning.
I checked it and I still hit the wrong button. Yeah, we are pruning. Yep.
and installing 500 Alicante Boucher on the terraced hillside with rocks. So we got a rock drill and all that stuff. Sorry.
Drilling. Yeah.
That's going to be fun.
I'm still installing numbers when I get chances. Still putting numbers on the.
Got the ones in.
Yeah. Have you seen that they're almost gone?
He didn't give us enough?
No, I'm just saying, like, I when I saw I was like, do we really need this much? But yeah. I went out there and put all the ones in where I had skipped because we didn't have any. And by the time I got done with that, there's just this like little bit left. And I'm like, yep, we needed that many ones. Yeah.
That's crazy, dude.
Yeah, it is crazy.
What else?
I think that's it on those updates. So we should do space weather, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Space weather news from spaceweather.com. A big sunspot is emerging. A new and apparently large sunspot is emerging over the sun's southeastern limb. Amateur astronomers with solar telescopes should point their optics to see what is coming. This is the same active region that produced a dramatic explosion from the far side of the sun on February 7th. Also, this is a kind of a long one with a lot of quotes, so maybe I'll skip some of it. But strange tides in the plasmasphere. Tides are one of the oldest phenomena known to physics. Ocean waters rise and fall like clockwork in response to the gravitational pull of the sun and moon. There's nothing surprising about tides. Yet researchers studying tides have just found a big surprise. There are tides in Earth's plasmasphere, and they are very strange. This discovery was published in the January 26th edition of Nature Physics. The plasmasphere is a lopsided donut of cold plasma inside Earth's magnetic field. It is created by leakage from the top of Earth's atmosphere. The outer surface of the plasmasphere is called the plasma pause, and that is where the tides have been found. So it is not surprising that the moon's gravity would stretch and modulate the shape of the plasmasphere. After all, the plasmasphere is made of matter, and matter responds to gravity, but the response is not what the researchers expected. They explained, interestingly, the lunar plasmaspheric tide forms a few percent bulge that is offset 90 degrees ahead of the Earth-Moon axis, which is significantly different from the high tide in Earth's liquid oceans. This inexplicable offset was verified by nearly 36,000 plasma pause crossings by various spacecraft over the almost 4 solar cycles from 1977 to 2015. So what's going on? Researchers aren't certain, but they believe gravity and electromagnetism may have joined forces to produce a new kind of tidal effect. Space physicists have long known that the moon's gravity affects winds in Earth's ionized upper atmosphere. This means the moon can actually modify electrical currents in the ionosphere, altering electromagnetic fields. The research team looked at data from NASA's Van Allen probes and found that indeed electric fields reaching up into the plasmasphere appear to be modulated by lunar tides. Computer models suggest that these fields can shift the bulge to a 90-degree offset position and explain its daily and monthly variations. Interesting. I wonder if they've ever heard of Electric Universe.
Electric Universe. I've never heard of it. All right.
Current conditions, solar wind speed 510.2 kilometers per second. Density is a low 2.18 protons per cubic centimeter. Sunspot number is 142.
Hey.
The neutron count is minus 0.2%, which is below average. And the K index is, the KP right now is 3.33. And the 24-hour max was 3.67. Both of these are in the quiet range, in the upper end of the quiet range. And that is your Space Weather News for the week.
Thank you, sir. Crypto. Shafto.
Let's see.
Well, while you're doing that, I can do this story.
I've got it.
Oh, okay.
BTC is $22,543.82, and ETH is $1,624.20. There you go.
All right. So I got this story from phys.org. Researcher finds cataracts and turbulence that seem to slow water's flow actually facilitate it. Since 1996, Duke engineering professor Adrian Behan has demonstrated numerous natural phenomena that validate his constructal theory in practice. In short, the theory states that all flow systems, animate and inanimate, evolve in such a way as to provide greater access to what flows. This kind of flow typically takes the shape of a few large conduits attached to many smaller vessels, whether the phenomena be root systems of trees, effluent branches of river deltas, or the bronchial tubes that bring oxygen into the lungs. He's even gone as far as to show its manifestation in hierarchical nature of extraterrestrial objects, wealth distribution throughout a society, and the evolution of the world's animal kingdom. But within the past couple of years, two papers caught Bejan. I mean, it's Bejan. Bejan? They caught Bejan's attention. Bejan.
Don't ask me how to pronounce stuff.
We're going with Bejan. That's cool. The two papers caught Bejan's attention that seemed to contradict the theory, at least on the surface, and made him curious. One from Caltech investigated a phenomenon that Bejan witnessed himself on a regular basis just outside of his driveway. When water runs down an inclined surface that can be eroded away, it doesn't form a single uniform channel. It creates a series of cascading pools that seem to hinder its flow rather than to help it. In the other paper, researchers from Cambridge investigated the nature of hydraulic jumps, which anyone with a flat sink has seen firsthand. When a stream of water hits a relatively large flat surface, it spreads out in a smooth disk before suddenly giving way to a thicker, turbulent runoff. Can you picture this in your head?
I think so.
So they have an image of this on the show. Or I mean on the article.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see.
So like the stream of water is coming down, it's hitting
I thought that had to do with like loss of momentum, but
yeah, this is cool.
Okay.
So it hits the base of the sink and it spreads out and it's perfectly flat and thin.
yeah,
And then suddenly it's like
there's a
all
phase
turbulent.
change.
Yeah, there's this phase change and it's all turbulent. Now I lost my place. Okay, so when a stream of water hits a relatively large flat surface, blah blah blah. All right.
How you feel?
Yeah. While scientists had long believed that this was caused by the effects of gravity, the Cambridge team showed that it is created entirely from surface tension and viscous forces balancing the momentum in the liquid film.
Ah, okay.
These two papers made Bejan consider a third potential contradiction: a thin sheet of water running down an inclined hard surface. As anyone watching rain flow down a driveway or sidewalk can see, the water forms a series of ridges running across the flow's direction. So this makes ripples, current ripples. The water forms these ridges running across the flow's direction. These lines are thick buildups of turbulent, rolling water waves that appear to hinder the flow. With these three seeming contradictions in mind, Bejan put the constructal law to the test by exploring a series of simple physics models. As the results published in the ASME Open Journal of Engineering show, despite appearances to the contrary, these phenomena improve the flow, as the constructal law predicts. Quote, "These papers exploring phenomena that I see at home on a regular basis made me question the theory," said Bejan, the J.A. Jones Distinguished Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Duke. But when I sat down and ran through the equations, I realized these effects are their own animal. Solving the apparent contradiction in all three systems essentially comes down to a single fact. Water travels with more momentum in a turbulent free fall than it does flowing smoothly over a surface. For the sink-based hydraulic jumps, Bayan found that while it may seem more efficient for water to spread out in a smooth disk, a thicker, turbulent layer actually increases the flow of momentum across the fluid layer. The hydraulic jump is a visual display of the transition of turbulent flow, and that turbulence, according to Bayan, is predictable and no longer a mystery. Bayan then puts together a long list of features of turbulent flow predicted by invoking the constructal law. In the case of the hard inclined surface, Bayan draws a diagram and explores the forces at work, including friction working against the water as it flows. He found that the roll waves are self-created cliffs that allow the water to roll over and fall freely for a short distance, increasing the momentum of the water and thus its overall flow rate.
Yeah, that's really cool.
It's the same thing as a cataract, like these pools and waterfalls and pools. That's cool.
And that this thin flow is actually that increases the amount of interaction with the surface. Yeah. Whereas like if you've got these different things,
Ripples.
the water can fall.
It's like flat fall, flat fall.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Very cool. A similar method of action is responsible for the series of cascading pools, because water falls over a dam more efficiently than when it slides down an incline. If water flows on an erodible surface, it will create a series of dams to fall over. This is awesome. The same idea can be seen in the design of pumped storage hydropower systems, where water is stored in a large reservoir and then released to travel through a turbine before reaching a second reservoir at a lower elevation. In these systems, the water travels vertically rather than on an incline because it produces a greater flow rate.
Yeah.
So engineers,
Sure.
yeah, they don't just slant the
No. Yeah.
They make it go straight and then just fall.
Yeah.
It flows over itself better than the surface. The best physics can be proven with simple physics, Bayan said. At first glance, these systems would seem to be impeding the system's flow, but it's not the speed that's important. It's momentum transfer. These examples go to show how important it is for researchers to question observations and consensus.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a great.
That's
little
really
story
cool.
right
Yeah.
there.
It's not getting in its own way. It's actually still taking the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it looks slower when you look at a series of pools and waterfalls.
Yeah.
Than if you see water flowing down a slope with rapids or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that's moving fast. Then you get to this place and there's a pool and a waterfall and a pool and a waterfall. Same speed. And it's actually more momentum.
Yeah.
Because it's falling so fast.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we should call it. I mean, the last segment was short, but we got to get up super early.
It's true.
It's getting late. So
I hate to cut it so short,
well,
folks.
it's not short. They still got 2 hours and 8 minutes.
It's a segment, though.
This is short, but we went.
Think about the podcast
We
in
went
segments.
super long on the third segment, so I think they're good. No one's gonna complain. I mean, if they do, we don't care.
I still got some beer left. No, it's all good. I would like to thank an anonymous donor, very special anonymous donor, for contributing to the podcast this week. Very much appreciated.
Yeah.
And I think that's all I got.
That's it. All right, brothersoftheserpent@gmail.com. We got a whole bunch of emails building up, so clearly we're going to have a communications episode coming up here soon. Maybe next week.
Did you get your affiliate link for Cosmic Summit yet?
I haven't.
Oh.
Yeah. Brothersoftheserpent.com for all the podcast-related stuff. That is the website. Soon to be updated. I have seen the first drafts of the new site.
Okay.
Yeah, it's,
Cool.
you know, need some changes, but it's going to be cool. It's definitely going to include like a lot more of the modern website stuff. Just the modern functionality of websites, the mobile version that's good, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's it. Thank you guys. We love you.
Always have.
Always will.
Good night, Adamo.
Get back to work.
We're cutting it off early.